The bells of Mount Zion Baptist Church rang out on a humid Saturday afternoon in Jackson, Mississippi, summoning both the curious and the skeptical. Word had spread fast in the county. The wealthy developer Richard Miller, a man known for his polished suits and political handshakes, was marrying Clara Johnson, a 60-year-old hog farmer whose boots were caked in mud more often than not. Folks crowded near the church steps, fanning themselves against the southern heat, some whispering behind their hands, others laughing openly at what they saw as the most peculiar union in years. To them this was comedy, high society bowing before lowly swine. Clara stood in a simple cream dress, her wide shoulders straight and unflinching, her dark skin glowing under the Mississippi sun. She had endured worse than stares, seasons of drought that threatened her farm, nights of worry for her younger brother Andre, whose disability meant he needed constant care, and the endless quiet battle to prove that dignity could bloom in soil where others only saw poverty. She had agreed to this wedding because the road mattered more than appearances. That narrow strip of land she legally owned was the only access to the brand-new meat processing plant Miller had built. Without her land, his trucks sat idle. Without her signature, his empire slowed to a crawl. He thought marrying her was the quickest shortcut to full control. She thought differently. Inside the church, the choir hummed softly, trying to stretch out the awkward minutes before the ceremony. Richard adjusted his tie, sweat dotting his forehead not from nerves of love but from impatience. He was a man who considered time a commodity, one he always owned. In his mind, this marriage was nothing more than paperwork dressed up in vows. He had rehearsed the smile for the cameras, arranged the guest list with influential donors, and ensured the local paper had a front row seat. It was theater, and he was certain he was the director. What he underestimated was the actress standing across from him, a woman who had learned long ago that silence can cut deeper than shouting. In the small dressing room before the ceremony, Richard let slip the truth. He leaned against a chair, chuckling with one of his aides who had slipped in unnoticed. "Once she signs," he muttered, "she can get lost. A little joke for the folks. Marry the hog lady, get the land free." His laughter was sharp, dismissive, the kind that stung more than an insult shouted across a field. He didn't notice that in the corner, Andre had set down his old cassette player, a relic from the 80s he rarely let out of his hands. The red record button was pressed, the wheels spinning quietly, capturing every word. For Andre, who often felt voiceless in crowds, the machine had always been his way of holding on to truth. Today it became a weapon. The ceremony itself passed with a strange, brittle beauty. Clara spoke her vows calmly, looking Richard directly in the eyes, while he rattled his off as if checking items from a shopping list. The congregation smirked and snickered, nudging one another when Clara's name was spoken beside his. They saw an odd pairing, a social mismatch, a punchline to carry back to their porches. But Clara's mind was already elsewhere. She thought of the field where her father once worked, the deed folded carefully in her cedar chest, the ink still binding across generations. She thought of Andre's hand clutching the cassette player, and the knowledge that truth often waits quietly until its hour arrives. When the ceremony concluded, cameras flashed, and reporters scribbled notes about the unexpected union. Richard smiled broadly, already thinking of the trucks that would roll down the road by Monday morning. Clara smiled faintly, thinking of the power hidden in that small black cassette spinning in her brother's pocket. She understood now that she didn't need to shout or beg. All she had to do was wait, let his arrogance reveal itself and hold steady. The land was hers and so was the recording. Together they would weigh more than his fortune. Outside, villagers and townsfolk crowded the gravel lot, their laughter echoing as Clara stepped into the sunlight on Richard's arm. The air smelled of fried chicken from a food stand across the road, mingled with the earthy scent of hog pens from her farm less than a mile away. Children pointed, women whispered, and men shook their heads as though they were watching a farce play out in real time. Richard waved at them like a politician on parade, convinced of his cleverness. Clara walked forward slowly, every step measured, her eyes steady on the horizon where the road cut through her land. In her silence was a promise. The show might have begun here, but the final act would belong to her. That evening, as twilight settled over Jackson, Clara removed her dress carefully and folded it across the back of a chair. Andre placed the cassette on the table between them, the tape reels glinting faintly in the lamplight. She touched it gently as if it were a seed yet to be planted. Richard thought the marriage was a finish line. Clara knew it was only the opening move in a much larger game. For years she had carried the weight of her brother, her farm, and her pride. Now she carried something else, his own words sharp enough to cut the false crown from his head. She looked out the window at the narrow dirt road that wound across her land, and for the first time in months she felt not burden but power. The road was hers, the land was hers, and in time justice would be hers as well. The morning sun rose thick and heavy over Jackson, painting the fields in a haze of gold and sweat. Clara Johnson was already awake, her boots sinking into the damp ground as she walked to the edge of her property. The dirt road stretched before her like a scar, cutting across her land straight toward the shining silver walls of Richard Miller's meat processing plant. Trucks had been trying to use it since the wedding, big rigs rumbling without permission, leaving grooves in the soil, their drivers laughing as though the road already belonged to Miller. Clara had decided that today those wheels would stop. She fired up the old tractor, the one that had grown through decades of hog feed deliveries and storms, its paint chipped, its seat cracked, but its engine still loyal. Slowly she drove it to the center of the road and parked it crosswise, metal frame blocking the path. Next to it she raised a wooden crossbar, a makeshift gate nailed together from planks, painted in white with the words "Private Land" scrawled in black. It wasn't elegant, but it was law. By mid-morning the first truck arrived. The driver leaned on his horn until the sound rattled birds from the trees, but Clara didn't flinch. She sat on the tractor step with her arms crossed, waiting. The man shouted insults, claiming he had deliveries to make, but she kept her silence. Another truck came, then another. Soon there was a line of engines idling, fumes curling into the humid air, men standing with hands on hips, frustration rising. One younger driver stepped forward, waving his clipboard, accusing her of blocking commerce. Clara finally spoke, her voice low but firm, reminding him that this was her land and no one had paid for passage. The man stormed back to his cab, but the message had been delivered. No one passed without her consent. Word spread quickly through town. By afternoon, Richard Miller himself drove up in a black SUV, accompanied by a county inspector and the local sheriff. They stepped out with confidence, dressed in crisp shirts despite the dust. Miller put on his smile, the same smile that had won elections for his friends and secured him bank loans. He tried to reason, offering vague promises of partnership, hinting at community progress. Clara stood her ground, repeating only that the road was private and the use of it required payment. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, warning her about causing public disorder. The inspector waved a folder of documents that supposedly showed easements and rights of way. Clara didn't move. She told them if they had real papers they could show them in court, not in the dust by her hog pens. Her tractor was her courthouse that day and she wasn't stepping down. That evening, as the trucks turned back one by one, neighbors began to gather. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty. They brought folding chairs, thermoses of sweet tea, even lanterns as dusk fell. Clara didn't ask them to come, but their presence made her heart lighter. Old friends remembered the time she had taken their children to school, or paid for bus fares to the hospital in town. They knew she had stood up quietly for others for years. Now they stood for her. They took shifts near the gate, keeping watch against anyone who might try to sneak through at night. The air around the barricade became almost festive, with children playing tag near the fence posts while adults swapped stories. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt that the road was not just hers but theirs, a symbol of dignity. The next day brought escalation. One of the truck drivers staged a scene, pretending Clara had swung a tool at him. He clutched his shoulder dramatically, shouting for witnesses. Miller's allies filmed it on their phones, spreading the story that Clara had attacked a worker, framing her as unstable. By evening, whispers traveled fast. The hog woman had turned violent. Clara's allies shook their heads, recognizing it as a trick, but she knew reputations could be shredded quicker than crops in a hailstorm. Still, she kept the tractor where it was. Every false tale made her angrier, but also steadier. Truth was in her pocket, curled inside the cassette tape Andre had guarded since the wedding. The lie might run fast, but truth had legs that lasted longer. By midweek, a reporter from the Jackson Clarion-Ledger showed up, notebook in hand. He was young, barely older than Clara's nephews, his tie askew, his shoes dusty from walking the road. He listened more than he spoke, asking about deeds, about her father, about the meaning of the land. Clara gave him short, clipped answers, but Andre surprised her by speaking up. In his quiet way, he explained how the cassette worked, how it had caught every word from Richard in the church dressing room. The reporter's eyes widened as he scribbled, realizing he had stumbled on a story bigger than a land dispute. He promised to return, and Clara saw in him a chance to let the truth stretch its wings. That night, sitting on the porch, Clara watched fireflies flicker in the fields. The tractor still stood in the road, a dark shape against the moonlit gravel. She thought of the plant looming in the distance, a symbol of wealth and power built on her soil. Richard Miller believed money could buy silence. But Clara had learned that silence could be a weapon sharper than any lawyer's tongue. She held onto it like a shield, waiting for the moment to strike. The road would not be surrendered. The land would not be given. And the tape, quiet in Andre's drawer, waited like thunder beyond the hills. The courthouse in Jackson smelled of old paper, coffee gone sour, and dust that clung to every bench. Clara Johnson had been there only a handful of times in her life, mostly to sign guardianship papers for Andre or to settle hog sales. Now she walked in with her shoulders squared, wearing her best Sunday dress, the one she usually saved for funerals. She carried a folder with deeds folded and refolded so many times the edges had turned soft. Behind her trailed Andre, clutching a cassette recorder to his chest as if it were a Bible. The courtroom was already crowded, with Richard Miller's people sitting smug in the front rows, polished shoes gleaming, whispering about how the day would end in their favor. Richard himself sat with his lawyers, confident as always, flipping through papers like he was already counting his winnings. The judge, a weary man with thinning hair, called the session to order. Miller's attorney opened with smooth words about progress, jobs, and community growth. He painted Clara as an obstacle, a stubborn woman clinging to mud when the whole county needed prosperity. He presented maps showing proposed easements, photographs of trucks waiting at her barricade, even statements from drivers who claimed harassment. When the attorney gestured toward Clara, the crowd murmured as though the picture of a hostile landowner had already been framed in their minds. Clara sat still, her hands folded tight on her lap, forcing herself not to fidget. She had known the accusations were coming, but hearing them under oath still cut deep. When it was her turn, Clara rose slowly and spoke with steady voice. She explained how her father had purchased and registered the land, how she had paid the taxes faithfully every year despite hard times. She held up the deed, shaking only slightly, and reminded the judge that no one had paid her for use of the road, that Miller's company had simply assumed it could take what it wanted. She said nothing about the tape. That was her weapon for later, not today. The courtroom was quiet when she sat down, the silence heavy enough to make Miller shift in his seat. But then his lawyer smirked and submitted video clips from cell phones showing the staged incident at the gate. Grainy images of Clara near a truck were replayed on the screen, accompanied by statements of assault. Gasps echoed through the room. Clara wanted to shout that it was a setup, but she knew denial without proof would sound hollow. She pressed her lips together and waited. Outside, the story spread faster than wildfire. Local radio reported that a hog farmer had attacked a truck driver, blocking commerce and threatening jobs. In the diner, people shook their heads, muttering that Clara had lost her mind. At the gas station, customers argued, some defending her, others insisting she was dangerous. Even some neighbors who had stood at her barricade grew nervous, wondering if supporting her meant risking their own standing in town. The pressure weighed on her shoulders like wet sacks of feed. Still, every evening she walked to the tractor, checked the fuel, and patted the hood like a loyal horse. The road was hers and no rumor could erase that. Then came the sheriff's visit. He pulled into her yard one humid afternoon, his cruiser crunching over gravel. He stepped out slowly, hat in hand, his face heavy with regret. He told her the county board was considering an injunction to force her off the road. He warned her that if another altercation occurred, she could face arrest. Clara listened without expression, her arms crossed, while Andre stood behind her, staring at the ground. When the sheriff left, Clara sat on the porch and felt her resolve waver for the first time. She thought of Andre, of the possibility of leaving him alone if she was taken away. She thought of the hogs that still needed feeding, of the taxes waiting in a pile on the kitchen table. For a brief moment, surrender whispered like a tempting lullaby. But that night, as rain tapped against the tin roof, Clara opened Andre's drawer and took out the cassette. She placed it into the old recorder and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room, smug and careless, bragging about marrying the hog woman just to grab her land. He laughed, dismissing her as useless, nothing more than a pawn. Clara closed her eyes, hearing every word sink deep. The anger that had almost burned out flared again, this time colder, sharper. She realized the tape wasn't just proof of deceit, it was humiliation turned into weapon. She had been underestimated her whole life, and now the very arrogance of her enemy had handed her salvation. She rewound the tape and pressed play again, listening until every word etched itself into her memory. She knew the time was coming to reveal it. Meanwhile, allies quietly emerged. The young reporter returned with questions, determined to hear her side. He spoke with neighbors, discovered inconsistencies in Miller's claims, and dug through county records. He even interviewed a former surveyor who confirmed that the easement papers were forged. Each scrap of information was like kindling stacked carefully, waiting for the spark of the tape. Clara didn't rush. She let the false stories run their course because she knew truth had patience. She watched Miller grow bolder, certain of victory, his trucks lining up again, his men mocking her from the edge of the barricade. She said nothing. Silence, she had decided, was her stage, and when the curtain rose, the sound of his own voice would drown him. The courthouse had been the opening act, the rumors the middle, but the end would play out in public. Clara began preparing for the community meeting scheduled by the county board, an open forum where citizens could speak. She borrowed an old projector from the church basement, dusted it off and set it beside the cassette player. Andre sat with her as she tested it on the living room wall, watching Richard's words spill into the air like poison revealed. For the first time since the wedding, Clara allowed herself a small smile. The road had been a battle of machines and documents, but the real fight was for dignity. And when the community heard the tape, they would no longer laugh at the hog woman. They would see her as the keeper of truth. The night before the community meeting, Clara barely slept. The house was quiet except for Andre's steady breathing in the next room, but her mind ran restless circles. She thought about the faces she would see in that church hall. Neighbors who had bought pork from her for decades, parents whose children she had tutored at her kitchen table, elders who remembered her father working this very soil. She also thought about Richard Miller's men, polished and confident, ready to twist every word against her. She pictured the sheriff sitting stiff-backed, trying not to look her way, and the county officials who had long chosen money over fairness. She knew the room would be divided, and she wondered if her voice alone would be strong enough to reach the hearts clouded by Miller's promises of progress. Morning broke heavy with humidity. Clara prepared breakfast, placing grits and eggs before Andre, but he barely touched the food. His hands trembled as he fiddled with the recorder, turning it over and back again. Clara realized he carried the same weight she did, though his shoulders were thinner and his world smaller. When she reached to steady his hand, he whispered that he wanted to speak too. At first, Clara resisted. She worried the crowd would mock him or twist his words. Yet when she looked into his determined eyes, she saw the same fire she carried, the same refusal to be dismissed. She nodded slowly, knowing that whatever happened, truth had to be spoken from more than one mouth. By afternoon, the community gathered in the church hall. The wooden pews were filled with farmers in work clothes, shopkeepers in pressed shirts, women fanning themselves against the sticky air, and younger men with skeptical eyes fixed on their phones. At the front sat the county board, their expressions carefully neutral. Richard Miller stood tall with his lawyers, greeting people like a politician, shaking hands and promising jobs. His confidence filled the room like smoke, suffocating but hard to grasp. When Clara walked in, whispers spread through the pews, some sympathetic, others doubtful. She carried no entourage, only Andre beside her, holding the recorder close to his chest. The meeting began with formalities, officials thanking Miller for his investments, others urging unity for progress. Then came the open floor. Miller's supporters spoke first, praising the plant and condemning obstruction. A truck driver recounted again the staged story of being threatened at Clara's barricade. Heads nodded, murmurs of disapproval rippled toward her. Clara listened silently, her jaw tight, waiting. Finally her name was called. She stood, her legs steady though her heart raced. She spoke without theatrics, telling the room about her father's land, about taxes paid through lean years, about neighbors who had walked that road long before any factory stood. She reminded them that dignity did not come from wealth, but from honoring promises and respecting ownership. She spoke of being mocked, of being painted a villain when she had only defended what was hers. Then Andre rose. His voice trembled at first, but it carried through the hall with a raw honesty no lawyer could imitate. He told them how he had sat in the church during the wedding, how he had heard Richard laugh in the back room about marrying the hog woman for her land. He told them he had recorded it, not out of cleverness, but because he wanted proof when no one believed them. The hall grew still. For once no one laughed at Andre. His simple words cut through every polished argument like a plow through soft earth. After he sat down, Clara unveiled the projector and cassette player. The room hushed as the tape began to play. Richard's own voice spilled into the hall, cocky and cruel, bragging about tricking Clara, dismissing her as worthless. Gasps broke the silence, followed by a murmur of anger that swelled like a storm tide. Faces turned from Richard to Clara, and the balance in the room shifted. Even those who had doubted her sat forward, listening again to the arrogance dripping from his every word. No lawyer's spin could erase the sound of his laughter. Richard tried to rise to argue that the recording was taken out of context, but the words betrayed him more with every repetition. Neighbors who had remained quiet suddenly spoke up, recalling favors Clara had done, food she had shared, lessons she had given their children. One by one voices rose to her defense, and soon the hall was filled not with Miller's promises but with Clara's truth. The county board shuffled papers nervously, realizing the tide had turned. The sheriff leaned back, his face pale, as though he too knew his part in this story was about to be judged. For Clara the moment was more than victory. It was vindication, not just for herself but for André, whose voice had never been taken seriously in this town. She felt a deep swell of pride watching him sit tall, knowing he had spoken truth to power. She also felt the weight of the years she had carried this land alone, now finally seen for what it was, not just dirt but heritage, sacrifice and survival. The hall buzzed with tension as officials called for calm, promising a decision would follow. But Clara already knew something irreversible had shifted. The community had heard the truth. It would not be silenced again. That evening, as the crowd dispersed, Miller's polished confidence had vanished. He avoided meeting Clara's eyes, his shoulders hunched under the weight of shame. People no longer clustered around him, their faith cracked by the sound of his own voice. Clara walked home with André, the old cassette player tucked under his arm like a trophy. Fireflies lit the path as dusk fell, and for the first time in weeks she felt lighter. The fight was not over, but the balance had tipped. The road was still blocked, the court still undecided, but the people had chosen to listen. And in a town where reputation was everything, that meant the ground beneath Richard Miller's feet had finally begun to crumble. The days following the community meeting felt different in Jackson. The gossip at the diner had shifted. Where Clara Johnson's name once drew snickers, now it carried weight. Farmers nodded to her when she walked by, and shopkeepers who had remained silent began offering small gestures of support. A bag of feed discounted, a kind word about André. The tape had spread beyond the church hall. Copies found their way to local radio, then to the state paper. Richard Miller's laugh, once his weapon of charm, now rang like a confession of arrogance. His allies scrambled, but the words were too clear, too damning. The county board announced a final public assembly to decide the road issue. This time it would not be in a church hall but in the largest auditorium in the county, with television cameras and reporters crowded into every aisle. Clara prepared quietly. She did not rehearse speeches or polish appearances. She fed her hogs as always, checked the fences, sat with André on the porch in the evenings. Yet she carried herself with a new steadiness. She knew the end was coming, not just of the dispute but of the years of being dismissed as the hog woman. For the first time she felt that the land beneath her boots belonged not only to her family but to her dignity. André sensed it too. He fussed over the cassette player, making sure the batteries were fresh, rewinding the tape to the precise moment. He told her he wanted to play it one last time for everyone, and she agreed. The truth, she believed, had to be heard until it could never be denied again. The auditorium filled early on the day of the meeting. Banners hung on the walls, some reading "Jobs for Jackson," and others hand-painted with "Respect the Land." The air buzzed with tension, a clash between progress and principle. At the front sat the county board, their faces drawn tight from the pressure. Reporters adjusted cameras, ready to broadcast every word. Richard Miller entered flanked by his attorneys, but gone was the swagger. His suit was perfect, his hair combed, yet his eyes betrayed the weight pressing down on him. He tried to shake hands as before, but most turned away. The polished image had cracked, and people saw not a savior of the town but a man who had mocked a woman he thought powerless. When Clara walked in, a hush spread through the room. She wore the same Sunday dress she had worn in court, nothing more, nothing less. André walked beside her, clutching the recorder with both hands. They took seats near the front, heads held high though the stares of hundreds pressed against them. The board began with formal remarks, reading through papers and citing laws, but everyone knew the decision would not come from the legal codes alone. It would come from the people watching, from the voices that had grown louder each day since the tape surfaced. The floor opened again and Clara was called to speak. She rose, walked to the microphone, and simply said she had nothing new to add. Her land was hers, her father's before her, and she had asked for nothing but fairness. She stepped back and let André take her place. His voice, still soft but steady, carried through the hall as he pressed play. Once more Richard's words filled the air, the mocking laugh, the boast of marrying Clara for her land, the cruel dismissal of her worth. The sound echoed against the walls, sharper this time under the glare of lights and cameras. No one could look away. The arrogance was naked, undeniable. The reaction came like a storm breaking. Murmurs rose, then shouts. People stood, some pointing at Miller, others demanding the board act. The weight of public fury bore down on the stage where he sat, and for the first time Richard Miller faltered. He rose slowly, his face drained of color, and walked toward Clara. Cameras turned, flashes sparked, and the entire room leaned forward. He stopped before her, and with the eyes of the county upon him, he dropped to one knee. The sight shocked even his own lawyers, who froze, papers in hand. He spoke barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught it. He begged her to open the road, promised he would sign whatever terms she demanded, admitted that he had gone too far. Clara did not answer immediately. She stood silent, watching the man who had once mocked her grovel at her feet. She thought of the laughter at the wedding, of the jeers at the barricade, of the lonely nights when surrender tempted her. She thought of André, whose simple honesty had turned the tide. Then she pulled a folded document from her bag, the servitude contract drafted by her allies. It demanded not only payment for use of the road but yearly contributions to a community fund for disabled residents, overseen by her guardianship of André. With trembling hands, Miller signed. Cameras captured every stroke of the pen, every drop of sweat on his brow. The board, seeing no escape, announced the contract binding. The aftermath came swiftly. The county land officer was dismissed within weeks for negligence, the sheriff reassigned to a distant post. Miller's empire staggered. Investors pulled away, wary of his tarnished name. The plant remained, but every truck that passed through the road carried the weight of the payments, a reminder carved into the town's memory. Clara, meanwhile, returned to her hogs, to the soil that had always grounded her. Neighbors who once doubted her stopped by to offer help, to thank her for standing firm. Children she had tutored brought her flowers, calling her a hero in their simple way. One evening, weeks later, Clara and André stood by the road as trucks rumbled past the open gate. A white ribbon fluttered on the post, tied there by neighbors as a sign of solidarity. André held her hand, smiling quietly, and for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to breathe fully. She had not only kept the land, she had claimed respect. The image of Richard Miller on his knees replayed in her mind, not as triumph for its own sake, but as proof that dignity could not be bought or mocked. In that moment, under the fading Mississippi sun, Clara knew the lesson was larger than her struggle. Respect for the weak was not charity. It was duty, binding every person who called themselves strong. And now, the road told that story every single day. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.